Hi everyone, thanks for coming along in such numbers. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, who's Dr. Ben Thomas from the University of Kent, where he is a senior lecturer in art history. And he has a very extensive body of work, which I can only really sketch out for you very briefly today, because it would take far too long to do more than pay a bit of a lip service to Ben's extensive portfolio. But I'll just tell you a few things about him that relate to the context of this series. He convenes the MA at Kent in curating, and indeed he was the founding curator of the Studio 3 gallery from 2010 to 2015. He has curated a number of exhibitions, besides the one about which he will be talking today. He curated The Paradox of Mezzotint at the UCL Gallery in 2008, and Alfred Drury and the New Sculpture at the Stanley and Audrey Burton Gallery in Leeds in 2014. He also founded the Kent Print Collection, which is a collection of prints where only undergraduate students can make acquisitions for the university. And I think when I visited Kent last December, I saw the pop art contributions that were adorning the walls of one of the buildings. Fascinating initiative. And recently he has co-curated two exhibitions, the first of which ended just in January there. It ran last autumn, and that was Drawing Together, which some of you may have seen at the Courtauld Gallery. And that was an exploration of the nature of drawing, and built on the collection, the Courtauld's own collection, as well as works by contemporary artists, including Stephen Farthing, Humphrey Ocean and Jenny Saville. And as you know, because you're here, Ben also co-curated the hugely successful and highly acclaimed exhibition Raphael, The Drawings, at the Ashmolean Museum, which was reviewed in numerous high-profile places, including The Guardian, where it was described as a magnificent, mind-opening exhibition. And so we're all very much looking forward to hearing about that. But let me just flag up a forthcoming book that Ben has been working on and that should make it into print in 2019. And that is on the fascinating figure Edgar Vint, and it's called Edgar Vint and Modern Art in Defense of Marginal Anarchy. I think we'll have to invite you back to tell us all about that in due course. But let's hand over to Ben to talk to us on the subject of curating Raphael, eloquence, and I can't remember the other part of your title, but eloquence is
definitely in there. So curating Raphael will do. Thank you, Eric, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to reciprocate, however inadequately, Eric's wonderful talk that he gave at the University of Kent on the art exhibition that we all enjoyed in Margate in one of its iterations. So, great pleasure to be here today. The talk I'm going to give to you is in two halves, and the first half is loosely based on a research paper I gave at the conference in Vienna in November last year that was part of our partners in this exhibition, the Albertina, and the events that they organised. And the second half is a more discursive account of how we came to curate the exhibition and what we were doing alongside it, because we were lucky enough to get a Leverhulme research grant that allowed us to run a series of interdisciplinary workshops alongside the curating of the exhibition. So putting 120 drawings by Raphael in one room guarantees you a great exhibition. And so that was the starting point for Catherine and I. Catherine is the keeper of Western art at the Ashmolean Museum. And so she was the person who initiated the project with the help of Achim Gnan at the Albertina in Vienna. And those two collections have the two greatest collections of Raphael drawings in existence. The Ashmoleans is the biggest in the world, and then the Albertina. So when two organisations like that agree to collaborate, you've already got a surefire hit on your hands, and really sort of living up to the potential of that was a big challenge for Catherine and me. And also, these are fragile and very precious documents of the creative process of one of the great artists in the European tradition. And so you need to have a very good reason to ask for them to be put into a box and sent to where you're hoping to show them to the public. And so developing that reason, that research justification for the loan requests, was a big part of what we were doing. Thankfully, I didn't think about government indemnity while we were doing this. We only actually discovered the day the exhibition opened that it was indemnified for £3 billion. I think I would have probably not been able to concentrate if I'd have known that before we began to work on it. So without further ado, I'm going to sketch out for you the research justification in this first half for asking for the equivalent of 2 government deals with the Ulster politicians. So, Invention, Disposition and Demonstration was the title of my paper in Vienna, and it was trying to flesh out the working title of the eloquence of drawing. So that's what we had in mind when we were developing the exhibition. The final title was, of course, Raphael the Drawings, and that was decided by the 2 directors of the museum. You learn quite a lot about museum politics doing one of these things. Quintilian, in his Institutio Oratoria of around 95 AD, says at one point, "Do we not see that the best thrown spear is the one that was launched with the most grace, and that the truer the archer's aim with the bow, the more graceful is the position of his body?" And he adds after this that composition, therefore, as it seems to me, plays the part of a sort of throwing strap or bowstring in giving direction and force to our thoughts. And here the ancient orator produces one of his more graceful analogies between affective oratory and physical attitudes. It's a fairly frequent analogy that we find in the rhetorical literature. And this fundamental analogy in rhetoric got me thinking that Raphael's drawings are figural in a double sense, based predominantly on the human form. And so one of the things we were arguing was that although he's a great master of perspective, Raphael's drawings are gestural initially in the space that they create. It's the pursuit of a physical gesture through the gesture of drawing that creates the space, that initiates the encounter on the blank piece of paper. But they're also figural in a rhetorical sense, in the sense that Raphael was seeking ever more expressive solutions through deviating from normal or common usage. As Quintilian puts it, the rhetorical figures are innovative forms of expression produced by art. So when you sort of deviate from the normal process, that's a figure. To what extent was Raphael aware of rhetorical figures? Well, here we can see him illustrating 2 of them. It's not showing up very well, but this is one of the very beautiful drawings that I was keen that we have for the exhibition, but in the end we couldn't have. In fact, I'm going to show you quite a lot of drawings that we couldn't have, probably sort of lingering regret. But this was because this particular drawing seemed to epitomise the theme of the exhibition. And it shows St. Paul rending his garments when he gets to Lystra. And it's a study in metal point for this figure here in the cartoon for the tapestries that's now in the V&A. St. Paul's emotional response to the blasphemy of the people of Lystra in sacrificing to him when they mistook him for Mercury, the god of eloquence. And there's Mercury in the background hovering over the scene that Raphael has devised, could be said to be the opposite of invention in rhetoric, or inventio, or finding what to say, and rather evacuates invention with a surpassing gesture, actio, or hypercrisis. So this sort of gesture, it's like, I haven't got words to express what I feel. Raphael's drawing, however, understood by analogy with the art of rhetoric, is an invention. The sureness with which he handles the metal point in the Getty drawing does not dissemble. What he discovers here through drawing is the image of mute eloquence. And strictly speaking, this is a visual realization of adinaton, or the inexpressibility trope. That's like, I've got no words to express what I have to say. Words fail me. I'm tearing my garments at the magnitude of your blasphemy. Incidentally, one of the few books that we know that Raphael read are the letters of St. Paul, because he does refer to them in a poem that he writes. Here's another example of a rhetorical figure in the work of Raphael. This is an engraving by Marcantonio Raimondi, a famous engraver that Raphael collaborated with, illustrating a series of scenes from Virgil's Aeneid, and there are drawings in Chatsworth for some of these marginal scenes. But the main scene is Neptune stilling the storm, and this is given the print its title, Quas Ego, where Neptune begins speaking and then breaks off. And this is the figure of aposiopesis, or breaking off a sentence, leaving the sense incomplete. And the reason why orators is that, it brings you back to the attention. So when you break up the normal sequence of things, you play with the expectations of your audience, it refocuses them. And it's interesting that we see Raphael doing this in two occasions where words fail and the physical gesture takes over. So this is the sort of awkward transition, really, between rhetoric and physical gesture that we were trying to chart through our research. Not everybody got it. One or two reviews, both published and more informal, were quite critical of this. So what we weren't arguing was that Raphael was necessarily highly rhetorically trained, but that he was part of a rhetorically infused culture, that he would have been aware through his friendships with writers. He was a friend of Bembo, Castiglione, Navazzaro, some of the great figures of Renaissance poetry, and through being briefed by his patrons to produce works like the Quas Ego, he clearly was familiar, if not a scholar, he was familiar with some of these things. But that he was also working in a way which was analogous with rhetoric. And this is where I come to the idea of invention in rhetoric as a way of trying to rethink Raphael's drawing process. So I'm giving a very unfair sketch of traditional Raphael scholarship now, but there tends to be what I call a tendency to think of drawings in terms of the teleological fallacy. That's what Catherine and I came to call it, which is that you have your end product, which is the painting, and that the drawings are stages in a process that lead to the painting, and that you can kind of explain the drawing by connecting with the painting. that was a very important part of this exhibition for us, is that we didn't include any of the paintings, because we didn't want people to go, oh yes, look, that's in fact just what I did previously. There you go. That one goes there. That leads to that. It doesn't necessarily. And so invention is an interesting way of thinking about this process. It allows us to rethink it. So inventing in rhetoric, or the discovery of ideas, is an extractive process, drawing out of the res, or subject matter, the points that the orator will then marshal as persuasive speech. And the search for ideas is a process that leads the mind back to what is already well known, to the loci, topoi, or in English often referred to as the commonplaces, frequented by memory. Not everything thrown up by this exploration will be appropriate to the matter in hand, and so discretion or judgment, guided by the rules of art and the notion of decorum or appropriateness, arranges the disposition or composition of ideas or inventions pertinent to the subject. Therefore, the finding of ideas and their placement in an ordered argument are closely related activities. Invention and composition mutually inform each other so that the rearrangement of what is already known can open up unforeseen avenues of exploration where novel thoughts can be pursued. What motivates innovation in a figure like Raphael is the desire to persuade, to move, to effectively and vividly demonstrate the truth of the case to the audience as if it was happening before their very eyes. So to summarize, invention and disposition lead to demonstration, or again, energia would be the rhetorical term for this. And we can see the analogous process at work in Raphael's drawings. If we go back to this, sorry it's so grainy, but this figure of yes, that would be great if we could.
Oh, sorry.
Is that too dark?
No, well, that's fine by me if it's okay with you. But yes, it's so anyway. You have this figure who's tearing at his clothes, and in inventing that figure of Saint Paul, in extracting the idea from the subject matter of the incident from the Acts of the Apostles, Raphael has gone back to the commonplaces in his memory, to a figure in one of the earliest drawings that he made. It's one of the earliest surviving drawings. This is a figure of an angel for an altarpiece in a drawing in Lille. Very interesting drawing because you can see different types of drawing from the model, schematic drawings like this one, all occurring on the same sheet. And here we can see this same sort of figure where these looping folds of cloth around the pivot of the knee are quite similar, if you could see it, to the later figure in the Getty drawing. So Raphael has gone back to a commonplace and then he's adapted it to the new purpose. We find him pushing decorum to its limits in order to maximize expressivity. And a drawing like this one for a soldier in a resurrection, this is an altarpiece commission that Raphael never completed, where he was working for Agostino Chigi, a banker in Rome, the Pope's banker, for an altarpiece for his funerary chapel. And so this is a figure of one of the guards by the tomb of Christ, who's startled by the eruption of Christ out of the tomb with the resurrection. Again, we can make a comparison with Quintilian, who says, "What is so contorted and elaborately wrought as Myron's famous Discobolus? But would not any critic who disapproved of it because it was not upright show how far he was from understanding its art, in which the very novelty and difficulty of the pose are what most deserve praise. So novelty and difficulty are things that Raphael aims for in developing more expressive, more effective means of conveying emotion through motion. Now, I wouldn't recommend Raphael yoga, in which you attempt to adopt the poses you find in Raphael drawings. This one is extremely uncomfortable and could only possibly have been held by the most flexible model for a matter of minutes. And I think that although he's working from a model, it's probably done in two halves. In fact, it's around the loincloth we have this slightly awkward area where Raphael's tendency to bisect figures is shown. And this is something that we notice working on Raphael, that he thinks in terms of units, often recombining units, often motivated by contrast. Antithesis is something that he's very interested in. In terms of a single figure, that might come across as contrapposto or pushing contrapposto to its limits, as is the case here. There's some debate about whether the left arm is by Raphael at all, and that's another debate that you get involved in. Like, how far do we allow great artists to be bad? I'm quite lax about this. I'm happy for him to, not every line to be perfect, but I started out this project not caring much about attribution, and that was a bit of a pose that I had. I don't care about attributions. Now I've become obsessed with them, which is what happens to you when you work on Raphael. And the other thing that we started to notice with this sort of external hatching, it's not a shadow. This is a shadow, cast shadow that sort of anchors the figure in space. But this, and above the shoulder, these are not shadows. He does it over and over again. I started to think of it almost like a sort of post-it note, where he's making a mental note. This is the salient contour here. This is the stress point. That's what I'm going to carry forward to the next drawing. One of the ways in which this sort of sorting through your memory bank, visiting the commonplaces, reworking them, it can also involve the tricky process of influence. Now, Michael Baxendale wrote probably the two best pages ever written on influence, which points out it's not something that happens to an artist, it's something that an artist does to the work of other artists. So Raphael chooses to be influenced by Leonardo when he copies from the workshop the Leda and the Swan, which is a document of the proximity of these two artists. Leonardo about 30 years older than Raphael, but it's clear that he gives Raphael access to his workshop and shows him his drawings. But also we can see Raphael beginning to work, and again, if the slide was better, the underdrawing shows that the feet are slightly longer. Raphael's drawings are very layered. He often works with what we call the blind stylus, or with a light black chalk, and then he'll go over with pen and ink. And so you can see him correcting. And he shortens the legs, and he makes the juxtapositions of the knees tauter, as if it's moving from a graceful, static contrapposto pose into a walking pose. He's starting to think about incorporating the standalone figure of Leonardo into a composition. So he's doing something to Leonardo's invention through revisiting it through memory. And then this, for me, is one of the more exciting of Raphael's drawings, because you can see this process happening in a literal example of cut and paste. So this is a metal point drawing, somewhat later than the drawing that he made in Florence after Leonardo, probably at the time he's working in the Vatican on the School of Athens. I say this because there are other metal point drawings that are also lit from right to left. The direction of lighting shows him changing his mind about things in a way which is very interesting. And if you see here, there are a few quick, decisive snips of the scissors that have removed the original legs, which might have been crouching or completely different. We can sort of see the remainder of the line there, and he's stuck on a new pair of legs. Legs that he's sort of taken, but reversed from the Leda from Leonardo. Thinking again in terms of bisecting figures, units of form that can be recombined. And what that does is it slightly distracts you from the fact that this is a female nude who's holding a child. There's the head of the child there. Can you all see that? So she is holding a child. The legs have been cut off here. There's some more of that external hatching. And so he's changed his mind completely. It's gone from a childbearing figure to a standing nude. And Marc Antonio uses this for an engraving of Venus. And so people say this is a drawing for the Venus. I think it's more accurate to say it results in the engraving of Venus. It's part of the process of invention. Another drawing that shows this process, and this leads us on to how we discovered Raphael composing additively on the same sheet. So you can't see this very well, but there is a lot of underdrawing in blind stylus. The most heavily worked areas are the torso here and this figure down here, where working with the metal point stylus on unprepared paper leads to furrows being put into the paper. They're almost invisible. You get used to looking at them in raking light, forgetting that you're holding a £50 million worth piece of paper. But building up from those areas, we see Raphael developing this figure first, again thinking in two halves. So torso and then legs, and then he's put this figure in. We can see the overlap here, this third figure overlaps, so reading the way in which they overlap over each other, we can see the figures added additively. And then thinking in terms of contrast, we get the expressive back that he's thinking about Michelangelo, who has done in the Battle of Cascina cartoon lots of expressive backs. Now, is this a drawing for anything? It's certainly used in the School of Athens here. But you can't see one of the best inventions, which is the reclining nude. So I tend to think of drawings like this as Raphael working through his variations, and he mines this drawing for all it's worth subsequently. But I think it was just that he was so proud of it that he smuggled it into the School of Athens. So here is poetry, a drawing for the figure of poetry on the ceiling of the School of Athens, of the stanza della Segnatura, where it has a title, Numine Afflata, the inspiration of the poet. And yet this isn't an inspired piece of work, because it's built up layers of drawing. Even here you can see some of the underdrawing showing through the chalk hatching, and then the grid that's been placed over the top of it in order to think through the process of coming up with the drawing. In this respect, Raphael is less of an idealist than he is someone who is inventing in a more workmanlike way. So his friends, Pietro Bembo and the nephew of the famous philosopher Pico della Mirandola had a debate about imitation, literary imitation. So how do you come up with the best style for writing poetry or writing Latin prose? And one school of thought says that like a bee in the meadow, you fly from flower to flower, taking what's best, and then you produce an eclectic synthesis. Now, theoretically, the big problem with that is, well, how do you know what's good? What is it that guides your selection? Why do you know that this type of prose style is better than this one? Why is this author more imitable than that one? And Pico said that this is because we have an innate idea in our mind of what's beautiful, and we use this to gauge and judge what's good. Bembo said, I don't have any innate idea in my mind, at least I'm not aware of it, so I just work with established models that are commonly held to be excellent, and it's through long, hard labour that I come at something good. Now, traditionally, Raphael is seen as closer to the eclectic idealists, particularly after people like Bellori in the 17th century recruit him to the idealist position. But if you're looking at his drawings, I see him more closely related to the Bembo camp in this respect. So my catalogue essay, Raphael and the Idea of Drawing, was actually meant to be ironic, because it was meant to say that he wasn't an idealist, but again, that was slightly misunderstood. Spell it out clearly when you... And another thing that caused me some problems was, and I've got to write a paper now on this, is how would Raphael have known about the concept of ideas? And the one text that we know that he read was Vitruvius. So we know he read Vitruvius because it was translated for him in 1514 by a scholar called Fabio Calvo, and Calvo's autographed manuscript of Vitruvius exists, and there are Raphael annotations in the margins. Raphael refers to Vitruvius and Vitruvian terminology in another letter he wrote on the villa, and he seems to do in a letter that he co-wrote with Castiglione. Unfortunately, he doesn't comment on this passage, but this is where the word idea crops up in Vitruvius, where he says that the forms of disposition, which in Greek are called ideas, are these: iconographia, autographia, and scenographia, which is plan, elevation, and section, roughly speaking, in architecture. So I was arguing that Raphael knew about invention and disposition and composition from reading Vitruvius. The architectural historian said, well, no, this is just referring to plan, elevation, and section drawings. But I'm going to argue that there's a gloss in the Italian translation, which is chae, forma, or figura. In other words, forms or figures. And that actually we can, because of that, extend it by analogy to inventions in other areas than architecture. And this is Raphael reworking that passage from Vitruvius, so he was certainly aware of it. Though he does change the names of the three types of drawings. Vitruvius is also a good source for a distinction that I like to make when looking at Raphael's drawings between cogitation and invention. So Vitruvius talks about these as two different types of invention, one which is careful study of something, and the other is a sort of very facile and quick sketchiness. And we can see these two things on one sheet here. This figure here of the pensive young man whose thought processes are sort of supported by this static right arm with this weight-bearing hand is juxtaposed on the same sheet with a very fluid series of sketches. It's almost as if, having carefully drawn from the life the figure of the young man, Raphael's hand needed to free itself with some spontaneous invention. So we get these two modes of invention on the same sheet. And again, we can play the game of linking the figure to the finished work. And he is, in fact, a preparatory study for this attendant of Euclid. So Euclid is demonstrating one of his theorems in the School of Athens, and we get a sequence of different moments in the process of understanding and comprehending something. So comprehension is very much the res here, the subject matter that Raphael is exploring. And it was nice to be able to work with, say, cognitive psychologists in the interdisciplinary workshop when we came to look at some things like this. The other little sketch, and you're going to have to take my word for it, that this is the head of one child, and here's the other, and an arm here, and then there are three heads for probably a mother figure. And again, we could say this is a drawing for the Aldobrandini Madonna in London. It's a drawing, I would argue, that results in the Aldobrandini Madonna along with other Madonnas, because this very, very fertile little sketch, and there aren't many of these that survive, is packed full of inventions that inform many other works by Raphael. And they're then carried on in related drawings where we can see him working through the most basic composition of all, which is Madonna and Child. So as the child moves, so it subtly shifts the implied framework of reactions between the mother and the child. Again, the overlapping forms. He's drawing over here. He's turned the sheet sideways. These are architectural drawings for the School of Athens. And then he starts with this drawing, goes out to the side ones, and then this overlapping here is the last one, which then goes onto another sheet, but here we lose the head of the child altogether. All he's interested in is that thrusting leg of the child and what that does. But another way in which this very fertile little sketch develops is that one of the heads here is looking backwards. And this looking backwards head we find here in this drawing of a aggressive man attacking a woman protecting a child. It's one of his commonplaces, the looking backwards head, repeated over and over again in different contexts. One of the things that his hands almost like automatically will draw. Here the figures are related to drawings for the judgment of Solomon on the ceiling of the stanza della Senatura, but where the lighting of those is from right to left, here the figures are lit from left to right. So he's changed his mind about the use. We also see him thinking in terms of the two halves of the figure again. And this drawing eventually, through a process of invention, results in the design for Marc Antonio's engraving of the Massacre of the Innocents. And I think it's with this that I'll sort of draw to a close the first half of my comments about the eloquence of drawing, because this is a case of Raphael actually owning the idea of invention, because there is the inscription in which it says Raphael of Urbino invenit. He invented this. So he's actually drawing attention to the fact that he's an inventor. It's also a very odd work. I mean, we're so familiar with this print that we've lost something of the oddness of it. The idea of a massacre of the innocents in which all of the soldiers are nude is strange, iconographically speaking. You tend not to take your clothes off when you're out killing babies. And it's sort of like a composition that brings together two of his overriding concerns in the period in which he'd been looking at the work of Leonardo and the work of Michelangelo in Florence, which is the heroic male nude and the Madonna and Child idea. So they've been brought together. The other thing to say is it's completely superfluous artwork. People who like to think of Raphael doing things to order and working to project, well, this is something that had no order. It's an autonomous work of art that he came up with himself simply because he had so many ideas that he wanted to share them. So it's like a supplementary work of art. There's even I'm tempted to go all Derridean with you and talk about the supplement there, but it is a gratuitous artwork in a sense. So I think very important in that respect. And very different from, say, one of his teachers, Perugino. So this is again just to summarise. If you were to look at the brief, if a document existed for what the patron asked for, you have representations of ideas, of fortitude and so on, and then representatives of those ideas, even a self-portrait of the artist. But Raphael comes up with, through figural invention, this is the study for Diogenes in Frankfurt, the School of Athens. It's essentially the same idea. On the ceiling we have philosophy, below the representatives of philosophy. But it's active and it involves us in the process of thinking, and it demonstrates to us, it moves us in thinking about those ideas. So, how did we go about trying to develop these ideas in a way that would be accessible to a wider audience? Because not everybody coming to the exhibition had read Quintilian, certainly. And so we did have the opportunity to involve experts from a wide range of fields. Sadly, not Tim Ingold himself, the social anthropologist Tim Ingold, but one of his students. And we were reading widely outside the discipline the work of people influenced by cognitive psychology or social anthropology. And this is just one example of how we try to think beyond the box in terms of Raphael drawings. So this is a nice example of Ingold's critique of what he calls hylomorphism, which is this concept that when we make something, there's a sort of blueprint in our mind, an idea, and that we introduce that into matter. So making something is the introduction of the idea into matter. And this is an experiment where he sort of disproves the hylomorphic concept, because he asked all of his students in Aberdeen to make the same basket. They're all trying to make exactly the same basket using traditional basket weaving techniques, but they all come out slightly differently, because the knot that's tied to bring together the upward pointing things through which you weave the horizontal parts of the basket work is going to be at a different height, because each of the students has a different height. They also have different strengths, and the tensile strength of the twigs were different for each one. So although they're trying to execute the same idea, the baskets are all slightly different. And equally, an unforeseen factor was that there was a wind blowing, a strong wind, which slightly tilted all of the baskets. So the process of making the basket was as much about the environment and the materials and the strength and gestures of the makers as it was about the blueprint that they'd all agreed on beforehand. And so this sort of eloquence we were also trying to look at in Raphael's drawing. Could we find traces of this type of process? Perhaps the most exciting drawing in this respect is this one, where it, I think, survives mainly because it's on the back of a very beautiful study in black chalk of a nude male figure, another one of these guards in a resurrection. But here we can see there must have been hundreds of these drawings originally, one of only a couple that survive now. Rapid, very fast sketching with the pen. We called this a brainstorming drawing, and some people didn't like the use of that term, but it also reminds me of an 18th century game that artists play. You could try this yourself, which is that you put 5 dots on a piece of paper and then hand it to your friend and say, come up with a figure. So the 5 dots are feet, hands and head for a figure. And artists used to swap these. And looking at the top, you can see that there is an idea for a figure there, the conception of a figure, with about 12 strokes of the pen. This is Raphael at his most economical. So the idea of Raphael's hand and the working of his hand was also a big part of what we did coming out of the workshops. And we're also helped by Albrecht Dürer writing on a drawing that Raphael sent him. And at the end here, Dürer writes that Raphael sent me this in sein Hand zu weisen. He sent me this to show me his hand. So the working of his hand. Well, there were lots of delicate loan negotiations. And this is a list of all of the lenders. And of course, when you start asking, you sometimes can't get the things you want. We really wanted this drawing in the British Museum, but it's been shown in Drawing in Silver and Gold in 2015. And you can only have an old master drawing for 6 months every 5 years. They're so delicate and they're so sensitive to light. So if something had been shown within the last 5 years, we couldn't have it. We've probably ruined things for the people who want to celebrate Raphael's quincentenary in 2020, because that's 120 drawings that probably won't be loanable anymore. And then these were the various workshops that we had, working in the Ashmolean print room wherever possible, so that invited guests were talking with the drawing in front of them. It was very interesting to have a musicologist talk about interval and pace and rhythm in a drawing, or and my friend Howard, a cognitive scientist, who talked about salience, what he could see as salience in the drawing, or perhaps most revealing of all, contemporary artists and what they brought to a drawing. So an art historian might say, it's this bit of the drawing that Raphael started with, and they go, no, why do you think that? No, the drawing starts down here. And so learning to look at drawings through the eyes of artists was very, very useful indeed. And although people had, sorry about all this text, this is basically just some responses to the workshops. So we had to collect all of these for the Leverhulme Trust. But basically people found the workshops quite an enlightening process, in spite of preconceptions they might have had. So finally, to talk you through the exhibition, we didn't want to make people think they were taking an exam when they went through the exhibition. One of the things we really wanted to do was emphasise the immediacy of drawing, the fact that drawings put you in a special place temporarily. They're unlike paintings which are sort of finished, drawings are part of an ongoing present. And so there is a date chart, but you didn't have to know anything about Raphael as you approached the drawing exhibition. And then the first thing you see is Raphael himself, or possibly Raphael himself. Catherine and I disagree over this. She thinks this is a self-portrait. I think it's just a drawing of a boy. But for the purposes of the exhibition, this was Raphael greeting you. And then on one wall of this first room, we have mainly Madonna and Child studies, and on the other, mainly the heroic male nude. The first room, and again, this wasn't stressed to people going to the exhibition, is based on invention. So the three principal parts of speech: invention, composition, expression, were informing the three rooms. And then mediating between the walls, we placed double-sided sheets. And Catherine's brilliant at this, hanging things in a way where you can see visual rhymes across space so that one drawing leads to another. Such a privilege to work with a really experienced and brilliant curator in that respect. And this is looking back towards the entrance. So this takes you through his early years and his training and his introduction to Leonardo and Michelangelo. And then we go into the second room, and there's a sort of space where these things come together in the Marc Antonio print of the Massacre of the Innocents. So this is slightly out of chronological sequence, but it's a big statement about Raphael as a designer, and it was the first opportunity ever to bring all of the drawings together for that particular engraving. And then looking beyond this little space where the engraving was shown, the only non-drawing in the whole exhibition, we then look into a room which is dedicated to the composition of the frescoes in the Vatican, with a sort of shrine to the Muses at the end. And the drawing there is the one drawing that we got from an American collection, from a private collection, and it's the last work to have been on the art market, and I think it was sort of $50 or $60 million. This room was a bit of a challenge because it's got such a high ceiling. It means the lights are further away, light levels have to be low for a drawing show, and these double-sided walls, although they were very effective in moving from one side of a sheet to another and linking walls across the space, it was hard to light them, so some of them were quite dark, and that was just a logistical problem that couldn't be overcome. Behind the Temple of the Muses section, we had this section about various drawing techniques with examples of the different drawing tools, and a desk to encourage people to do drawings themselves. Some visitors thought this should have come early on. We thought a lot about it, and the idea here was that, again, not wanting to bog people down with, is this a metal point, is this a pen and ink drawing, that people would get halfway around the show and then be grateful to be shown the tools rather than be on their mettle thinking that I have to know this. But some people would have liked it at the beginning. And then the final room, where the colour scheme reflects the preponderance of red chalk drawings, was dedicated to the expressiveness of drawing and is largely Raphael's late drawings, culminating with the final painting that he did, the Transfiguration, where we brought together a group of the Transfiguration drawings. So from Ashmolean's point of view, it was good that the exhibition started and ended with two Ashmolean drawings. And it ended with a drawing that so this is a view of the room. We deliberately chose drawings all the way through that were uncontroversial in terms of attribution. We didn't want it to be a show about attribution. So on the whole, everybody agreed that the drawings in the exhibition were all by Raphael. But when you get to late Raphael, it's one of, as those of you who studied art history might know, it's one of the most fought over and difficult questions, and inevitably there were one or two that some people didn't agree with. So this drawing is not universally felt to be by Raphael. He had a very accomplished young pupil called Giulio Romano, part of a larger workshop, and it's often very difficult to tell what's Giulio and what's Raphael. I took the view that this was Raphael, because it's got the quality of invention that we've seen in the earlier part of the talk. This is the Leda figure that he's learned from Leonardo, twisted slightly. There's an additive process of putting together. There are different levels of finish. We have some of this external hatching. The only thing that's really difficult from an attributional point of view is the left leg, which is horrible. Everybody agrees that's a really horrible left leg. And it's mainly because it isn't shaded. And it isn't shaded because Raphael wouldn't have had to have shown that in the final, so this is sufficiently worked through that he's not concerned necessarily. The final workshop of all was one where we invited the Raphael scholars to go around the exhibition with us, and that was quite scary. But people who spent their whole lives arguing over the attribution of. So I think Paul Joannides shifted from completely rejecting this as a Raphael drawing to accepting that the top half is by Raphael and the bottom half is by Giulio Romano. And then the final work is the drawing from the Transfiguration, which slightly cynically, when talking to journalists, we just routinely called the greatest drawing ever made. And you repeat something often enough and it becomes a sort of truth, and it started being called the greatest drawing ever made. But my challenge to you is, if there's a better one, please show it to me. There it is. And it also is a nice place to end the exhibition because it epitomised the eloquence, the two types of eloquence that we were talking about. And I tried to bring this out in the label that I wrote. So on the one hand, it exemplifies the mute eloquence talked about by poets such as Dante, the visible speech that Dante talks about in Purgatorio. On the other hand, it's also eloquent in terms of the different styles of mark making and the control of the chalk and the way in which you have some areas of very, very finely shaded work. And then in the hair, for example, it's very free making of lines. And then, even things like the pounce mark here that shows him shifting the thumb. Just these very slight calibrations of detail that make, again, always heightening the expressiveness. So once you've done your work, you let the public in and you wait with trepidation for their opinion. And here are some photographs from the Friends Day of people going around the exhibition. These are all taken by the Ashmolean photographer, and some of them are staged, it has to be admitted. So this is mother and child, drawing my mother and child. Actually, it's someone who works in the shop with a child that we just grabbed. But there you are. But people did look very closely at the drawings, and that was one of the really nice things about the show, that people did feel that they spoke to them that was part of the feedback that we got. It's quite a challenge, it's quite sort of recondite material in some respect, and many art historians would say you need to have studied this for at least 30 years before you'd be able to understand it, but we didn't believe that at all. We thought Raphael's drawings speak more eloquently than his paintings. Now, this is not just vanity, this is to show you Catherine, and also to point out, this is taken on the opening, that we are both extremely stressed at this point. And I don't know if you can see, but part of my moustache fell out. I was so stressed. So this is, another side of putting on a big exhibition. Thankfully, people liked it, and the reviews were very, very nice. And they were quite extensive as well, and that's been useful in justifying to the Leverhulme the fact that they entrusted us with a lot of money to do this. My favourite review wasn't the Guardian one, but it was in a publication called The Amorist, which sadly is now folded. which is an erotic review, which said that you certainly got some interesting ideas about the beauty of the male body coming out of this exhibition. So I was introduced to all sorts of interesting reading matter I hadn't heard of before. And then, of course, there's the museum's own process of reflecting on the impact of the exhibition. So these are just a few slides from the very thorough analysis that went afterwards. So we exceeded the visitor target, and most people who visited enjoyed the show. 93% had decided to visit the exhibition before arrival. That's important for the museum because it meant that these weren't people who just walked through the door. They decided in advance. When it was clear that it was going to be a hit, the Ashmolean spent a lot of money on posters in London train stations and underground stations, and that led to a spike in attendance as well. So it was interesting. Visitor survey findings on the demographics. Nice. Oh, sorry, you can't see this at all, but it sort of goes like this. So mostly it was young people below 20, and then retired people. And the lowest bit is people like me who work all the time and don't have time to go to exhibitions. So that's fairly common, but it was a nice demographic spread as well. I mean, we expected it to be more people over 60 than in their 20s and 30s, but it was good, and visitor satisfaction was fine. People thought they got value for money, though there were some criticisms. Some people wanted to see the paintings next to the drawings, so that we knew that was going to be a controversial decision. The video should have been at the start of the exhibition. It was too dimly lit. Everyone says this about drawing shows. Nothing can be done about it. It's just the way it is. But it is a challenge as a curator. How do you get around that? Long, wordy explanations that some people felt were inaccessible. Well, that's fair enough. They were long and wordy. But one of the things we tried to do was descriptive analysis that would help people, guide them in looking at the drawing. So again, that was a calculated risk. Overcrowding. Successful exhibitions do tend to be overcrowded. So the last couple of slides are about the opportunity that came up to curate a show at the Courtauld. And this Drawing Together show was an opportunity to explore some of the themes that we'd been working through with Raphael, but with a much wider range historically and stylistically of drawings. And I was basically making visual pairings of drawings that superficially look similar, but then you're being questioned as to, are these the same things? So we see sort of rapid sketching movements in a Romney drawing and a Hans Harten, but where Harten is an abstract artist moving away from representation and story, Romney is moving towards it. But again, the idea of the rhythm of the hand is something that's there in those two drawings. I like this drawing because it's kind of like an emotional balance. On the left, you have this sort of looping lines. We did do a lot of drawing ourselves, actually, while we were curating. So there are several drawings I did to try and understand this Harten. So when you're doing the left-hand side, you're feeling quite pleasant. It's quite nice. It's like you're going for a walk. You're sort of circling around, and you do it for long enough, you feel quite happy. The other one here, up and down, you start to feel very irritated and anxious and a bit aggressive. And then there's this sort of dying away where the looping comes back. And the two are held together with the patch of yellow and the implied framing of the sheet. So So, I mean, to what extent is it anachronistic to try and make these visual connections with Raphael and Harter and Romney? And that was the very playful nature of the Courtauld show, which was meant to be the sort of light-hearted accompaniment of the Raphael exhibition. And we had a final workshop there and invited some wonderful people to take part. So this is Howard, the cognitive scientist, and that's Paul Hill's famous professor of Renaissance art, and this is Humphrey Ocean, the artist, and also involving students as well, which was nice that we were able to do that. So I hope that gives you some sense of what we were trying to do with the Raphael show and the process of putting it together. I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have.